Hello. Hi. How are you? This is Coach Aaron Saft in the Running Is Life podcast. And as you could probably tell, I'm under the weather. But the show must go on. So I ask your forgiveness if I sniffle, sneeze, cough, or blow my nose, or just sound horrible. But wanted to kind of get into this topic here. I know we've done a lot of kind of deeper dives into mental aspects of running here lately, and it's just kind of what's been intriguing me. I feel like there's a lot of the physical aspects out there, but we don't talk a lot about the mental aspects. So just digging in a little bit where I find some interests and want to kind of share with you what I'm finding. So if you saw the title of the show, we're talking about the actual series Alone, which I just watched the most recent season on Netflix. What an interesting show! What an interesting premise! And for those that don't know the show, it is about survivalists, and each season that they host this show, they select roughly 10, sometimes more, participants. Now, the participants are, they are well-seasoned survivalists. They have to send in videos and do interview process in order to make the standard to be on the show. And the show has a different location every season, and this season they were up in the Arctic. They were so far north. It was the potentially the coldest, most harsh season that they had produced yet, and I think this was season 11. So these people are just some really amazing, survivalists. They have such skill that they can hunt and fish and create shelter and fire, all with minimal objects, and we'll kind of talk about that. But the idea is they are dropped off in the wild, and they each have their spot. They are remote, isolated from the other contestants. They are all by themselves, and they're given camera equipment to film. What they see, what they think, what's transpiring. So they've got game cams. They have like a regular video camera. They have GoPros. So but their job is to not only survive but to film what they're doing to survive. They film the process, which becomes really engaging, and you kind of start to, become more engaged and more invested in each individual as the season goes on, and as they kind of bear themselves to you. Their vulnerability is exposed especially after a longer period of time. You become more and more engaged and tied to these individuals, and you're rooting for them. And it's so hard when you see the person tap out. They have satellite phones, and at any time they can tap out. So we're going to talk about that piece of it as well. There are also med checks, and if they don't meet certain medical standards, then they're pulled, which we'll talk about that as well. Now, all this to say, I'm going to tie a lot of this to our running, because there's a lot of this, this season that had so many crossovers that I saw and felt and witnessed, and kind of exploring these topics. I kind of had to reassess some of what I was thinking and doing, as we should often do. As I said, we don't talk a lot about this mental process, but this right here, this show Alone was very mental. These people came with key physical attributes to help them survive in one of the harshest environments on the earth. And excuse me, the solitude that they have is incredible. I don't want to ruin anything if anybody is going to watch this new season. But the expanse, the time that they spend alone in order to win this series, and the winner takes home $500,000. Second place doesn't get a thing. It's just the winner takes home $500,000, which is, it can change somebody's life. Obviously, that's a lot of money, and these people come from very, very humble backgrounds. These are not wealthy people. These are people kind of living on the fringe of society at times, where they just don't have a lot, and $500,000 could certainly change their lives and make it so that they can live a little bit more comfortably. So they're playing for a lot. It may change not only their lives, but their families' lives. And they kind of get into that and talk about it over the course of the season. But the solitude that they feel, it's oftentimes that we say, the loneliness of a long distance runner. A lot of times we're out there training by ourselves, putting in all these miles, all this time, just by ourselves. And we have that solitude, not to the degree of course, what the people in alone are going, but we have this solitude, and we have like probably two options, right? As I see it, we have the ability to embrace the solitude, embrace the fact that we're alone, and enjoy that moment of solitude, embrace that alone time, because, many of us, we're doing jobs and family where, we're constantly surrounded by people and overstimulated by the society around us, be it through social media, be it through any other media channel, TV, radio, podcast, whatever. We can be overstimulated at times. And oftentimes when we go for a run and we shut everything out, including podcasts and music and such, then we truly can feel that isolation, especially if you're deep into the woods and you haven't seen somebody for, some time. It can feel quite isolating. It's oftentimes after, especially after an ultra where you spend so much time out in the woods. I can think back to, especially the 200 miler where, I was in just remote places for so long and seeing my crew maybe every 6 to 9 plus hours. It becomes just like kind of normal. And when you get back into like a large setting where there's more people around, more stimulus, you can be overwhelmed by it, right? The solitude is quite peaceful. So, we can embrace that solitude. We can enjoy that alone time, or we can be thankful to have company as well. When we do long runs, we can have friends that run with us, of course. When we do ultras, many times we can have pacers that accompany us. So, it depends on you and what you're used to. And that's something that you have to take into consideration. We always talk about when you sign up for a race that you have to think about what are the variables that are involved, and I'm going to get into my example of the Tour de France here in just a moment when I talk about something else. But again, can we embrace that solitude? Are we good enough in our own minds, in our own space? Are we comfortable enough with that space to be alone for long periods of time? My answer is no. I can do long runs up to a few hours, but once it starts to get into, these longer distances where, I'm running alone for 20 plus hours, I prefer to have company. Not that I can't do it, but at the same time, I prefer that company. That's the type of runner I am. So, knowing that ahead of time can change, what your instance, what your experience may be. Whereas like these people on alone, the solitude is with them for the duration of however long they stay out there. And we're going to talk about how they deal with that solitude, because it really does. You can tell when somebody's starting to crack and they're about to press that button to be rescued, to be pulled from the show. What it breaks down to is the ability to stay present and not get too caught up in future possibilities. There's an instance on the show where one of the contestants felt there was going to be a certain outcome. He was really banking on the fact that this outcome was going to be the reality. And when it didn't present itself, that is when you could see the chinks in his armor, right? Everything began to crack and break down, and you could tell he wasn't going to last much longer. Not setting ourselves up for that, not having an expectation, and I want to be clear here, like having a goal is fine, but to expect that goal is not. We don't want to expect that a certain goal is going to come to fruition, because if that goal is not coming to fruition, those cracks begin to form in our armor, right? We start to break down, and the outcome becomes less likely of being even a finish, because we've not met that expectation. And so while having a goal is a great idea, it's also, and I've talked about this multiple times, it's also great to have your backup goals and to be okay with those backup goals. Now, to have backup goals is one thing, but if you're not okay with those goals, you really have to consider, is it okay to, if things go south, like, will you be okay with the result? Or B, yes, I can come to terms with the fact that I'm not going to meet my A goal, and B is just fine, or even C or D, right? But again, if we don't come to terms with that, and we have these expectations, and those expectations are not met, we're going to have a hard time getting to the end, to the finish line. So staying present and not assuming future possibilities are inevitable or expected is super important. And so, staying present, for us, that presence may be aid station to aid station or mile to mile, depending on the distance of the race, chunking it and putting it into blocks that are more feasible is the reality. And you could see on the show, these people, as they lost daylight, again, we're up here in the Arctic Circle, and they're going into winter where, it can be 24 hours of darkness. They got to a period in the show where, it was about 4.5 hours of light. And, can you imagine having 19.5 to 20 hours of darkness and just having to hunker down in a shelter that's not much bigger than you? That's really difficult. And, their ability to stay present and engaged was massive, and we'll talk about that presence and engagement here in a little bit. So the solitude, it did wear on people, and a lot of times it became because they missed loved ones, and they watched the previous seasons. They saw these people suffer through exactly what we're about to talk about. They're missing the people they loved, be it significant other, be it children, be it mother, father, whoever it may be. They so missed their family, and it stemmed from guilt. They felt guilty that here they were, on this show day after day, doing really nothing but survival. That was their job, was survival. They started to feel guilty that, oh man, my significant other is having to take care of the kids and do all the household chores without me. Their roles and their responsibilities felt neglected, and so they felt guilty. And many times, a lot of us feel that guilt on the weekends when we go out for long runs. We don't give ourselves the grace, going back to a few podcast episodes ago, to allow ourselves this time to enjoy what we truly enjoy. And that's tough sometimes, but the reality is, if we have that conversation, and the more successful people in this show had conversations with their significant others so that they were on the same page, they had the same goals, they had it planned out so that the responsibilities wouldn't fall solely on the significant other. They put into place everything so that when that person was out there, they can remain present and not feel the guilt of being out there for days or months upon end. And that's when people became successful. So we need to do the same thing. If there is obligations that we feel we're not fulfilling because we're going out for a run, and those have the precedence, those are more important, those have the priority in our lives, then we need to accomplish those prior to running. For me, for instance, I know that if I have work that is not done or I feel will not be done if I go for a run, then I get that work done first, because I won't enjoy my run if I don't get it done first. So I make it a priority of getting, that work done, and then I can go enjoy my run. It's the same thing for my long runs, is I make sure that, I take care of everything. My wife doesn't have to do much when, usually I get going before she wakes up. So I make sure that, when she wakes up, she's not coming downstairs to, much to do. She doesn't have many chores, other than things that she wants to accomplish. I'm not leaving anything there that's going to, put extra burden upon her. And that's the big thing, is, thinking of others, right? And what can you do to make sure that there is no burden upon them so you don't feel any guilt for going out to run? Sometimes I take care of that the night before, and other times I just wake up a little earlier and make sure it's done, be it, feeding the dogs or, putting the dishes away or cleaning up, a mess that was left from the night before. I like to leave things in a state where I know, everybody else, when they wake up, they can take care of whatever they need to do, not something that's, left over that, somebody else could have done but didn't. I feel guilty when that happens. The other thing is, I let them know, I'm going out for X amount of time, that's what I'm doing. And then I make sure I say, hey, do we have anything else planned for the day? Is there anything I need to make sure I'm back before? And then I just back up the time. So if I have to start, super early, I start super early. That way I'm back and get ready in time to do whatever it is we need to do as a family. I don't have any guilt because I'm not going to miss anything, other than them waking up and kind of, going about the morning rituals, right? And then we have our time together. So avoiding that guilt by doing these things is massive. And again, the people on the show, they had the ability to not feel that guilt. They still felt guilt. Obviously, they're out there for a long period of time, but at the same time, they knew that the significant other was on board with what was trying to be done. Right? They knew that end goal, that winning that $500,000, meant just as much to them. And that's something we as runners sometimes have a hard time making our significant others understand. I am so grateful that my wife understands my craziness, my longing to do these events. It's a part of who I am. It's part of what I enjoy. And, she's on board with that. It's great to have that support. If your significant other doesn't, understand, then perhaps you can make them more engaged or more involved with what's going on, so they see, what you're doing, and explain to them why you're doing it. Why is it so important to you to do this? And that's a great question to ask yourself. Is, why do I continue to do this? What is it about this that gives me this drive to go so far? And I'm going to conclude with what some of my thoughts on that. So we'll get to that a bit later. Along with the guilt also comes the longing to be back with those they love. And that was ever present with me when I did the Tour de Gens, and it hit me pretty quick. Tour de Gens, we can't have pacers, so I could only see my wife and Nathan at certain aid stations. And what hit me was when I got into the night, is I'm gonna potentially going to be out here for 3 or 4 nights, and these guys are they're having to drive around and wait on me, where we all could be together and kind of enjoying our time together in Italy, and that was really difficult for me. I was not prepared for that piece of it, being away from them for hours upon hours, and knowing that they're just waiting, albeit they waited in some pretty cool locations. It was something that I wasn't prepared for. And, moving forward, if I'm to do Tour de France again, I'm going to be better prepared for that. And I kind of talked about that in previous episodes, but these people on the loan kind of face the same thing as they begin to long to be with those they love. And that's what really starts to become critical and can really challenge them to stay in the game, is really just if they can get past, that inability to be with their family, which is, that's so hard. And, they do a great job of kind of filming themselves, and again being exposed and vulnerable to the fact, and that's again a conversation that you have to have with your spouse. My spouse, Beth, she was like, hey, we are here for this purpose. Like, I get the mission. You need to be able to move forward. And she gave me that stern talking to, like, this is what we're here for. This is what we signed up for. We understand what's going on, and we're okay with that, and like, maybe that's something I should have talked to them previously about. But I didn't. And, it's, again, going back to being open and having these conversations can really help you succeed at what you're doing. Okay. So those that succeed make themselves one with their surroundings. And this was pretty incredible to watch. And one thing that I've seen season after season, I've watched, as many seasons as I can, just because I'm fascinated by this. And the people that are the most successful is they call their location home rather than a shelter or a temporary dwelling, right? And this concept of home is where the heart is. Home is what we make of it, right? So our presence, our comfort level is greatly diminished when we feel we're just in this foreign environment and not a part of that environment. It's not a part of who we are or what we're, trying to accomplish. And that's a mistake, right? We may not know the area, right? We may travel to places that we don't know and we're unfamiliar with. And so that becomes difficult to call that place home, to be comfortable enough to be in that environment and thriving, because we're totally unfamiliar with the surroundings, and that's very difficult. So in taking on these races that we do, it's great to watch videos and kind of get a feel, right, for the environment, get a feel for what it looks like, what you'll be going through, how tough is it going to be, what is the ground like, what is the temperature like, all of these things that kind of give us more and more beta, right? More information. That's massive, so that we can be comfortable with that surrounding. We don't have to call it home. That's not the point of it. The point is to be as comfortable as you can in that environment so that you feel safe and you feel comfortable moving forward and through this environment, because you're a part of that environment. Where these contestants on alone, they find joy in their surrounding rather than being overwhelmed by them. It would have been, I'd be overwhelmed by the Arctic, right? I'm not prepared for that. That's not something that I would ever be really, I'm going to go to the Arctic and do, a race or try to camp there for a long period of time. But these people, they found joy in being where they were. They were able to stay present and deal with the environment because they knew what the environment would present. They prepared for that environment, just as we can prepare for any environment that we will face on race day, be it extreme hot, extreme cold. These are things that we can prepare for. And once we get there, we can experience it and experience that joy of being there because we're prepared for it. And then these contestants, I think, time after time saw the big picture, right? This is what kind of helped them to keep moving forward, right? Whereas they had to stay present. That's for sure. They had to stay in the day they were in. They also could see the big picture. If they stayed in the day they were in and completed the tasks they needed for that day, then they had an ever better chance of moving on to tomorrow and the day after that, and potentially staying there long enough that they could win this series. So, being able to suffer in the present was more accomplishable. It was easier to suffer knowing that there was a bigger goal, there was a bigger picture. And again, knowing that bigger picture meant something to not just you, but others, your family, etc. That goal was the ever presence of being able to suffer. And, we have to do the same thing in racing. We have to be prepared for suffering and know that we're not going to achieve our goal. We're not going to make it to the finish line if we don't suffer, at some point in this race, and dealing with that suffering. So, the amazing thing about these people, because as I said, it got to a point where they were spending 20 hours in their little shelters that they built. They had to keep their minds occupied in the downtime, and it was amazing to see how they occupied their minds and their time. There's one contestant that created a bass guitar and his own dice and game. He had birch, which he used as parchment, and a stick that he kind of burnt the tip of to have some charcoal to draw, and he created toys for his kids. Like, it was amazing, to come up with these things that he could do in the time that he had to spend in his cabin, because there really was nothing else he could do. He couldn't go outside to hunt or to fish because it was so dark and cold. These temperatures get down into the negatives, which is, just really a tough environment to be out and doing things within. So it's keeping their minds occupied, just as, we have the ability to either zoom in or zoom out. The potential for you to zoom in when it's necessary and zoom out when it's necessary is massive. When we zoom in, we're more observant, right? There's something going on and we need to find resolve to it. So we zoom in and start to problem solve. And then there's times where, we need to zoom out, right? There's times where we just need to pass time. We don't need to be focused. Like, if there's there's something that you can't deal with until you get to the next aid station, then you need to zoom out and stop focusing on it, because there's nothing you can do to change that at the moment. If you've gone through all your problem solving and there's nothing you can do, you just need to wait it out. So rather than focusing on it and becoming so intent on it that it's starting to drive you crazy, you have to zoom out. And that's what a lot of these contestants were able to do, is zoom in when they needed to and zoom out when they had to, which is pretty incredible. And that comes to the next point of problem solving, and continuing to find ways to survive, to keep moving forward. This environment became more and more harsh. At the beginning of the season, the rivers were all ice free, and they could fish from the banks. They could use their ghillie nets and try to catch fish. And then it became colder and colder, less activity from the animals. So they were, deploying snares and trying to hunt with bow and arrow. And then, it became where the river's frozen and they had to ice fish. And it was amazing to watch their ability to keep surviving, keep moving forward. They created caches for their catches so that, they could kind of stock up a little bit. There was ever present dangers. There's, wolves and bears and moose, right? And so they had to, be aware of their surroundings at all times. And then there's wolverines and other animals that try to steal their food, birds, etc. So they're constantly vigilant and, being aware of their surroundings so that they can, continue to have food, to continue to survive. And, it's the same with us. We have to be ever vigilant, right? We have to be ever present and continue to problem solve as we go along. So, that was pretty incredible to watch these people. I really enjoyed, watching them overcome things. It was pretty cool. Then, another thing that I saw was that they played to their own strengths. One gentleman did not bring a bow and arrow because he's never shot a bow and arrow in his life, right? It's like us, where the race is like, poles are suggested, but you've never used poles in your life, and you're like, well, if they're suggested and they're advantageous, then I should bring them. Well, if you've never used poles in your life, they may become more of a negative than a positive. So we have to decide, is this something that's going to help me or hinder me, right? And that's a big decision. So thinking of those things ahead of time, and playing to your strengths, that's more beneficial to you, right? And we'll talk about some of the some of the ways that we could talk about their gear a bit, and we'll talk about that later, because they were only allowed to bring in so much gear, and just like us, we can only carry so much. So we're going to talk about that in a bit as well. And the last point on this kind of topic is being grateful goes a long way. Having a grateful heart, even if the situation is so tough, being able to stay grateful was massive. And I had this comedian, Jimmy Carr. He's a British comedian. He kept popping up in one of my social media feeds, and he's very, very blunt, very forthright. Doesn't care what you think. He's telling you exactly what he thinks. And people ask him, what do you think about this? It's very, back and forth exchange with the audience. And he tells them exactly what he thinks. And, at times it's very blunt. He could be very awkward because it's not the response that somebody would typically say. He's not considering others' feelings. He's just saying exactly what he thinks. So, when a person asked him, what do you do before bed? And he said, I have a moment of gratefulness. And, basically he decides what he's grateful on from that day or from his life, which totally surprised me. I didn't anticipate that answer, but, that shows that this being able to be grateful, this level of gratuity that we can show to life and for opportunities, can have so much of an impact. It can change us and change our way of thinking. And rather than, be lost in a negative moment, we can be grateful for that moment, be grateful for that opportunity to be there. And that will change the mindset. And that's massive. And these people, the most successful ones kept showing a high level of gratefulness. And that's something that I've seen through the seasons, is just this ability to be grateful, even in the toughest of circumstances, which is incredible. I really enjoyed that aspect of the show, and really kind of taught me, to remember to be grateful for things. He kind of does like a journaling. The comedian Jimmy Carr does a journaling of his gratefulness. I don't go to that length, but it's something that I should really start to incorporate as well, is, taking a moment to be grateful for things and, remind myself of what I'm grateful for. So the next topic I want to get into is the urge for the contestant to use that satellite phone, to call it quits. For us, that would be a DNF. Did not finish. Because, the urge to end it just becomes more and more over the course of time once that thought, comes into our minds. One of the contestants described it as, pushing that button is a dose of sugar versus getting a whole cake. You're just kind of... you're getting a little hit, but your disappointment is going to be exponential because you weren't able to get the whole cake, right? And you have to live with that decision. You're going to be more disappointed. Obviously, if there was something that you could have controlled, it's going to gnaw at you that you probably could have finished. If it's beyond your control that you have to drop, of course, that's a totally different. It doesn't make it palatable. It doesn't make it any easier, but you knew it was beyond your control, so you probably can come to terms with that. Whereas, when you drop out and you could have done more, then it becomes really difficult. These contestants, they had medical checks, and they had to have their weight, pulse, their capacity to breathe and function. They had them tested a few times during the season to make sure that they were, okay to continue. And there were contestants that were pulled out based off of their medical condition. And, that's really tough. And we may be looking for an out, or we may talk ourselves into an out. What comes to mind is David Roche's Western States last year, where he talked himself out of his performance. He convinced himself that he had rhabdo when he did not. I did the same. I thought I was having some kidney pain, and I got into medical, and they're like, "No, you're okay." But it put a chink in me, a crack in my armor. It's difficult once you have that little crack. That crack starts opening up and becomes a crevice, because your mind starts slipping into places it shouldn't, and you become weaker and weaker mentally, and then it starts to manifest itself in your physical ability to do something, because mentally you've kind of checked out, which is tough. It's really tough when that begins to happen. So we have to think, what could the long-term effects be? Are we potentially causing permanent damage? These poor contestants were putting themselves in this environment where the potential for frostbite was massive, and the potential to lose an appendage, toes, etc. That's a reality. And some of these contestants were of the mindset that they would rather die than be pulled from this event, which was quite extreme. Obviously, I can think back to one of the contestants that had children, and the thinking was that I'd rather die doing this than give up. It meant that much to him, which is that's commitment. But for us, we have to think about our long-term health and our long-term effects, as well as our mental capacity, our mental state, our sanity. These people put themselves through so much starvation and suffering. Was just incredible to watch, and the kind of the mental breakdown that they experienced was just incredible. And here's where we kind of talk about the gear. These people were only allowed a certain amount of items. They were restricted in how much they could bring. I don't remember the number offhand. I think they could have certain things that counted towards like a 25 item gear list, and then they had 10 other items that they could choose to bring in addition to those. So not a lot. I think they were allowed like 3 pairs of socks, for instance, which is just incredible. So they're limited as to what they can bring, but they also have to think about those items critically. What would be crucial for their survival. So how would each piece of gear function? And it was incredible to watch them. One gentleman used his rain jacket in order to wrap food and kind of put it up high so that it was out of the reach of predators. So using these, what they did have to serve them multiple purposes. But we can also have the wrong gear, the things that don't serve us. So we have to be really cognizant about what we're carrying, what functions will they serve, and will they serve the function we need. I talk to my athletes about a suggestion for a rain jacket, because the one that I was going to count on this summer, I took out, and that was the Montbell, the Rain Trekker, and I took it out over the course of the past few weeks with the winter weather that we had between the freezing rain and the snow and the wind, and just discovered that it was not a great wind barrier. It didn't protect me like I had hoped from the wind. It did a great job with the rain, but I was cold. Now, yeah, you could wear more layers, but I'd rather not have to carry more gear and just have a rain jacket that serves a better function of not only rain but wind protection as well. So I went out on the market and kind of shopped around. I found a Esoterics, I think it's their Norva jacket on sale through REI. So I picked that up, and I haven't tested it yet. But I've been looking for something to replace my Innovate Storm Shell. The version 2 that they've come out with for the Innovate, I just didn't feel kind of met what I was looking for. and reading the reviews, I just wasn't comfortable. So I didn't want to update that with something I just wasn't, comfortable with off the bat. And when I, kind of shopped through and looked at the esoterics, it kind of, fit what I was looking for. So definitely going to be trying that. But, again, these items are so important to our success. I can, think back to races where I didn't have what I needed and it put me at risk. It put me at risk for not finishing because I didn't have what I needed. And these can lead to costly mistakes, the next point here, and how we deal with them. So, we can be so close to cutoffs and then we can do something silly. I can think back to one of my athletes that, got into the aid station, was ahead of cutoff, but then didn't keep an eye on time and put themselves in risk of, not getting out of there on time. Not only that, but not getting to the next aid station ahead of the cutoff because they weren't leaving themselves enough time. These are small mistakes, but they can ruin our races. And that's what we have to be aware of is these things is we constantly, again, have to be present and mindful about what's going on and where we are. The stuff, things like our nutrition, we may practice it, all through training and nothing goes wrong. And then on race day, it all goes to, what, and we're left thinking, what happened? What could I do differently? Well, the capacity to have other options and train with those other options is essential, right? Like if we're just training with one thing, this is what's going to work, and it fails us, then we're left to wonder, well, what can I do? And, that's when we have to rely off of aid stations because we may not have any other options. So creating those other options and having those other options is super important. And then how do we deal with discomfort? That's kind of become a big topic, and that's something that I hope to keep diving deeper and deeper into is like, how do we deal with this discomfort? As I talked about with my Masoji in December, being comfortable with being uncomfortable and just accepting the fact that, yes, I'm going to be tired. That's just part of this. Taking each day for what it was. And that's the same thing we have to do in the races is, continue to understand that not every moment is going to be ideal. Not every moment is going to be okay. And that we have to learn to be okay with that and to work our way through it. And because if we take the mindset that, woe is me, this is the end, then it probably is going to be. So, recognizing what it is for what it is. It's tough. It's bad. It's, it could be worse if we don't do something about it. So what are we going to do to problem solve and get through it? That's the big thing. The last point is something I touched on earlier. The clarity and new purpose many found from the experience on Alone was simply amazing. Often that's what brings us back to long events. We want to experience that clarity once again, right? We want to feel that change, feel that capacity to do something that maybe was unimaginable, to really challenge ourselves in that way, to dig deep and to discover who we truly are. And that's what this show did to so many contestants. It showed them who they truly are and what's truly important. So I encourage you, go find your clarity. Go find your purpose. Keep moving forward, my friends. Running is life.